Hi everybody, welcome to this workshop on data visualization. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we are connecting virtually, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. I am speaking to you from Toronto, the place where there are trees standing in the water in Mohawk. This is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Today, this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Simon Fraser University respectfully acknowledges the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Coquitlam, Quaquat, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen peoples on whose unceded traditional territories our three campuses reside. This workshop is part of a series on social media communications created with support from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Canadian Network for Modeling Infectious Diseases, and the Pacific Institute on Pathogens, Pandemics, and Society. To access other workshops in this series, please visit youtube.com/@PIPPSBC. I want to share a little bit about me before diving into the content of this workshop. My name is Natasha Vitkin, and I use she, her pronouns. I completed my Master's of Science in Cancer Immunology and then completed my Master's of Public Health. I am currently the Knowledge Translation Lead at DesignSet Cell, a scientific illustration company that specializes in creating accessible, engaging, and scientifically accurate graphics. In this role, I supervise projects with a focus on knowledge translation, including infographics and presentations. This workshop has 3 learning goals. By the end of this workshop, you will be able to, firstly, describe the benefits of visualizing data to communicate information. Secondly, determine how to select appropriate data visualizations based on your communication goals. And finally, articulate and apply various steps to improve the clarity and effectiveness of data visualizations. This workshop is structured into 3 parts. In the first part, I will outline the importance of effective data visualization to communicate information. Secondly, I will outline various strategies and tips that you can use and apply to improve your data visualizations. And finally, I will walk through an example and interactive activity of visualizing cancer survival data. Data visualization. What is it and why use it? Data visualization is the graphical representation of information. As you can imagine, this is quite broad and encompasses visualizing both qualitative and quantitative data. Often, the process of data visualization involves moving data from spreadsheets into graphs, maps, and other kinds of visuals. Data visualization has become an increasingly important skill for business, science, tech, marketing, etc. There are many benefits to communicating data visually. Firstly, it's often easier to communicate the key messages concisely by using a graphic to show the interconnectedness and trends, as opposed to trying to describe the same information in the graphic in words. As well, Social media content that contains visuals often has higher reach and engagement across various social media platforms than text-only content. Visuals also have a higher retention than text content, meaning the information communicated visually is usually better remembered by the viewer than the information communicated via text only. Using visuals also helps both technical and non-technical audiences understand and interpret what can sometimes be very complex data. Finally, visuals help identify trends, make decisions, and use the data to tell a story. So all of these factors increase the likelihood that the data will be understood by its audience and then shared, and finally used to drive action and decision making. Data visualization is vast and varied. This slide shows a graphical abstract that I supported, which was published in 2022 in the journal Blood Advances. And this data visualization shows a cost-effectiveness graph of L-tromopeg versus intravenous immunoglobulin for the perioperative management of immune thrombocytopenia. As you can see from the graph and the various colors and text added to it, the data in this graph illustrate that L-tromopeg, which is the compound that the researchers were testing, is less costly and more effective than intravenous immunoglobulin. This slide shows another kind of data visualization, which unfortunately many of us became all too familiar with over the past few years. So this shows, using both a line and a bar graph, the laboratory confirmed COVID-19 weekly case counts and rate by reported date in Ontario. You can see the number of cases on the left, the cases per 100,000 people on the right, and then the reported week on the x-axis at the bottom. The last example I wanted to show is a bit more fun than the previous slide. So this is from a company called Information is Beautiful, which I highly recommend. And they created a visualization of various dogs based on their popularity on the y-axis going vertically. And then they also compiled a score for each dog based on their intelligence, costs, longevity, grooming, ailments, and appetites. And then they mapped the dogs accordingly. So you can see that there are some who are inexplicably overrated, some who they classified as hot dogs, some overlooked treasures, and finally the rightly ignored in the bottom left-hand quadrant. In this section, I will share some steps and tips to help you create effective data visualizations. Before you start diving into creating your awesome visualization, I would recommend taking a step back and strategically picking the appropriate tool that will be best suited for your needs. Consider the following factors when you do so. Firstly, is the tool suited for analyzing and visualizing the data, or is it only for visualization? As well, is the tool able to be integrated with other programs, or is it more of a standalone piece? So for example, many visuals created with Microsoft Excel can be moved and then edited in other Microsoft Office programs, whereas a vector file created in Adobe Illustrator will likely not be able to be edited in other programs if needed. As well, consider the organizational availability and policy relating to your tool. Maybe there are only a few things due to privacy or legislative standards that your organization uses, so that may also limit what tool you can use. Consider as well the potential for data and visualization updates. So is the data being continuously collected? Is this something that you want real-time updates to the visual based on any new data that comes in? Or do you want these updates to be automatically completed? As well, it's important to consider the cost. Some tools might be included in your workplace. Some are also free and open source, but others are not and have a substantial fee associated with using them. Finally, consider the interactivity. Do you want an interactive visual that the audience can click through and engage with and filter the data based on what they want to see? Or is it okay to have just a static visual, perhaps a graph that is presented or shared on a poster? There are many different tools that you can use to create your data visualization. And this slide outlines some of them. It's not meant to be a comprehensive list. So here I've listed the tools, many of which I've used. The ones that are less complex and customizable are on the left, and the ones that are more complex but more customizable are on the right. So you can see here we've got Canva, Venngage, Piktochart, Google Sheets, Microsoft Excel, Google Looker, Microsoft Power BI, Raw Graphs, Adobe Illustrator, Inkscape, SAS, Tableau, and R. So there are lots of options, and when you're choosing a tool, again, consider the factors in the previous slide, but also consider what kind of visual you want to create. Is it okay to create something perhaps a little less complex, but that will be easy to create and easy for you to quickly action? Or are you looking for something that's maybe more complex that you can customize more, but might take a bit longer to actually put into play, might require some coding, some learning, and some further development? All right, so after you've picked an appropriate tool to create your visualization, it's time to dive into the data set and explore it to determine your key message. And just an assumption here, in this example, I am assuming that it is quantitative data that has previously been cleaned. So I recommend exploring the data set a few different ways. Often it's a great step to create different kinds of charts to see how the variables look in different visual formats. So potentially creating a scatter plot, a bar chart, a line chart, etc. And we'll get into different kinds of charts later in the workshop. As well, you can explore the data by disaggregating it by different variables. So for example, looking at trends by demographic variables such as age, or if it's a time series, looking at different periods of time and seeing whether those trends compare to the trend in the entire time frame. It might be necessary as well to perform further analyses. So perhaps performing statistical tests on the data, perhaps modifying the analysis to create new variables or combining different variables as needed. So some questions that I like to ask myself at this step are, what sticks out to you? So what aspects of the data do you want to convey to your audience? Is there perhaps a clear outlier in terms of a group that has a different trend? Is there a really consistent trend across different groups, etc.? What would you want to tell an audience about the data? A note as well that this tends to be a very iterative process of perhaps it looks like, starting, creating some different visuals, taking this to a team member, seeing what they think, returning back to the data, creating a different visual, etc. So this doesn't isn't usually a one and done step. After you've explored the data set to determine your key message, the second step is to pick a type of visualization that communicates this message appropriately. So I've listed a few guiding questions here, and you should be asking yourself, is your intent or is the main message of the data that things have changed over time? Do you want to do comparisons between similar categories? Perhaps you want to show how one thing or metric compares to a target, or are you intending to show parts of a whole? Are you intending to show flow? So perhaps a process with different metrics for each step in a process. So consider what kind of visualization will communicate this key message in the best way. There are many great free tools that can help you pick a visualization type that communicates your message. The one I've selected here is from High Charts, and they have a chart chooser. This is a screenshot of the chart chooser from High Chart. And as you can see, it has many different kinds of charts. There's just a screenshot here, but there are more on the full site. And it illustrates what kind of data these charts can show. So whether there are segmented into different categories, categorical data, or whether the data is continuous. And it also shows what the objective of each kind of chart is. So you can see bar charts in the top left can show trends between categories. But there are different kinds of charts that can show the flow, the distribution of variables, and the relationship between variables. So when first starting out in creating visuals, I would recommend using a tool like this to give you a sense of the various different kinds of charts that are out there, and then what they are best suited to show. And again, thinking here, what is the message from the data that you're trying to communicate? Because that will determine what kind of visual you will select. I want to spend a bit of time doing a little spotlight on visualizing correlations. So correlations are quantitative visualizations that show the relationship between variables. So when there are 2 or 3 variables, scatter plots are common to show how the variables interact or are related to each other. So you can see on the right, there is a scatter plot showing the relationship between the body mass on the x-axis and then the head length on the y-axis of various birds. And the colors of the dots indicate whether these data were taken from female or male birds. So that looks great. That is clear and easy to understand, and it represents 3 variables: the body mass, the head length, and the sex of the bird. However, sometimes we are interested in showing associations between more than 3 variables. So often, for example, when we're looking at gene expression data from the lab. So another way to visualize correlations are heat maps, and these can visualize correlations between many variables. These kinds of visualizations use color to differentiate between high and low correlations. So you can see on the right, there is a gene expression heat map showing the changes in the tumor immune microenvironment during disease progression in patients with ovarian cancer. And you can see that the log2 fold change in the top part of the visual is represented by the intensity of the color, with red being a high log2 fold change and blue being a negative log2 fold change. On the bottom graph the bottom part of that visual shows the Spearman R value, with again color being used to show the intensity of the R value. So an R value of 1 would be red, an R value of 0 would be white, and an R value of -1 would be blue. The heat map is a kind of visualization that has commonly been used in the literature for visualizing correlations. However, I want to present here a correlatogram that takes a slightly different approach and uses the element of size. So here you can see that there's still a color scale to indicate whether the correlation is positive in blue or negative in brown. But here, the magnitude of each correlation is also encoded in the visual by the size of the colored circles. So you can see that using this kind of visualization instead of the previous one of a heat map de-emphasizes cases or conditions with correlations that are near 0. And therefore, it draws attention to the variables with the largest correlation values.
The next step in creating your visualization is to integrate effective design principles and to remove quote-unquote chart junk, which I'll speak to on the next slide. The effective design principles I'm referring to can be summed up using the ABCDs of layout. And these refer to alignment, balance, contrast, and duplicate. Here, alignment refers to keeping different elements of the visual in the same line or plane. Balance means considering the proximity of different parts of the visual with each other, and also ensuring that there is enough white or negative space in the visual so that it doesn't appear cluttered or crowded. Contrast refers to using different stylistic elements, such as color, font, and size, to differentiate and draw attention to different elements of the visual. And finally, duplicate means using a similar style for similar elements. And this will ensure that the overall visual has one cohesive look or feel.
As you're integrating effective design principles in your visual, you should also be on the lookout for anything that could be quote, chart junk. And this is defined as any visual element that isn't necessary to comprehend the information in the visualization. So some common forms of chart junk include 3D effects, grid lines, different illustrated backgrounds, and illustrations right in the visual itself. And the reason to remove these forms of chart junk is because including them puts the burden on the viewer or the audience of the visual to determine themselves which elements are the key to determining the message and which are just distractions meant to enhance the overall style or look of the visual. So this chart junk distracts from your main message and may even complicate or obfuscate the message entirely. So a quote that I like to remember as I'm creating any visuals are, "When in doubt, leave out." And the illustration on the right side is a pie chart that I created. And you can see, for dramatic effect, I have included many elements of chart junk. So I've added 3D effects. I've added different textures to the different pieces of the pie. And because of these different chart junk elements, you can see that it's really hard to read the graph and the pieces the sizes look warped. For example, the slice that's 19% looks bigger than the slice that's 33%. And I've also colored the graph to be intentionally confusing. So although peach is yellow, strawberry is blue. So again, by doing these different making these visual choices you can see that it makes the graph really hard to read, and it puts the burden on the viewer to really sit down and understand, and they might get confused by some of these extraneous chart junk features within the visual. After integrating the effective visual principles and removing any chart junk in your visual, what I recommend is often highlighting your key message or messages when appropriate directly on the visual. So this can involve using text and or colors to emphasize the key message in the visual you created, either directly on the visual, or if perhaps this is a figure for a journal article, highlighting the key message in the associated text and caption. The next step after integrating appropriate visual elements and removing any chart junk is to stylize your graphic and ensure that it is accessible to different audiences. So when you're choosing different colors to include in your graphic, firstly, consider combining the color element with patterns, textures, and or shapes to help differentiate the element with something else besides color. As well, consider using shading to ensure that the graphic is accessible if it's viewed in black and white or printed in black and white. As well, when you're looking at different color combinations, and avoid overlapping the following colors because they can't be easily differentiated by people who are colorblind. So I've listed them here. So avoid overlapping red and green, green and brown, green and blue, blue and gray, blue and purple, and green and black. And this will ensure that people who may be colorblind can appropriately understand and take away the main message of your visual. A helpful tool that I recommend when you're picking colors is a website called coolors.co. And this is a free website that has a variety of different color palettes and also allows you to preview the color palettes to ensure they are accessible for people with different kinds of color blindness. Another awesome and free resource that I recommend when you're picking colors is this contrast checker. And this allows you to test whether combinations of colors can be read easily by low vision readers. So you can see here that the kind of blue text on the green background doesn't have a high enough contrast, and it fails this contrast checker, meaning that it's likely not accessible and shouldn't be used in any visualization. The next step I recommend when creating a visualization is to contextualize and add some more details about the data when it's appropriate to do so. So consider including the following information in the visual's caption and or in any associated text describing the visual: the sample size of the data, when the data was last updated, and any major caveats with the data definition or collection measures. And when you're determining what kind of contextual information to include, if you're including any, I like to try and put myself in the shoes of the intended audience that will be reading and engaging with the visual, and try to assess what their familiarity and interest is in this contextual information. So for example, thinking about the data in the COVID pandemic case counts, it's likely very important to show either on the graph itself or in the associated text when the data was last updated, because people want to know if the information is current. However, if this is for a general audience, it might not be appropriate to include specific information about the data definitions and or collection measures. Those might be better suited to include in a piece for a more technical audience. When thinking about contextual information that might be appropriate to include in your visual, I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about the importance of numerators and denominators in data visualizations for public health purposes. So the COVID-19 pandemic, as many of us know, resulted in many visualizations showing both numbers, such as deaths, hospitalizations, and infections, and rates. So mortality rates, case fatality rates, hospitalization rates, and infection rates. Numbers are only numerators, so what is being counted, while the rates mentioned above contain both numerators and the denominator, which refers to the total population that the numerator is being counted from. In visuals showing rates rather than numbers, consider including the definition of the rate, the numerator and denominator, and/or any other pertinent information about these data. So these kinds of information are especially important for visualizations and broader communications intended for the general public. And this information is also important to include during outbreaks when people are actively trying to use the information in the graph to assess their own risk. For example, a reported case fatality rate of 6% means that 6% of people who developed condition X died of it. However, the denominator of condition X only includes patients who were diagnosed with the condition in a hospital setting. And some people with mild cases of condition X were not admitted to the hospital and therefore are not included in this denominator. Therefore, the actual case fatality rate is likely lower than 6%. So in this example, including this caveat and that the rate is actually likely lower than 6% would be important to include in a communication for the general public who might be trying to assess their risk of condition X. I wanted to show an example of a graphic that includes the numerator and denominator directly in the visualization. So this is an infographic about measles from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States. And it includes the numerator of 9 and the denominator of 10 in the infographic using an icon array to show the attack rate of measles. So you can see that the numerator and denominator are represented visually, and the designer of the graphic also included the contextual information of what this actually means. So rather than saying the attack rate, which is an epidemiological term, instead the graphic says that measles is highly contagious and that it's so contagious that if one person has it, 9 out of 10 people of all ages around them will also become infected if they are not protected. So again, showing the numerator, denominator, and also what this actually means for someone to use the data to make their own risk assessment. The final step when creating any kind of data visual is to get feedback from your intended audience. Whether that's one person, which is great, whether that's multiple people, which is even better, consider asking anyone looking at your visual the following questions. What is your main takeaway from this graphic? So this is seeing whether they understand the message that you're trying to convey, and asking if there's anything unclear. So is there anything that could cause confusion and maybe could dilute or even obfuscate the message of the visual? And I always recommend this in any kind of visual or product that one is creating, because it can elicit really meaningful feedback to improve the overall clarity and effectiveness of your final visualization. All right, so this is the final part of the workshop where we will walk through an example of putting the steps I've been talking about into action using an interactive activity. For this example and activity, I am going to be visualizing the US cancer rates from 1977 to 2015. And I'm using a subset of the data available in the linked Google Doc. I strongly encourage you to pull up this data and follow along with me. I will be using Excel to generate these figures as I find it very fast and easy to use, but if you're following along, please feel free to use the tool that works best for you. So I'm going to be exploring the data set by graphing the data in different kinds of charts. So here you can see the data in a kind of traditional line chart showing the different kinds of cancers, each on a different line. This graph shows the data in bar chart format. So you can see the different survival rates in 2015 for each type of cancer. Here's the data in a clustered column graph. So you can see how the survival rate for each cancer changed over time. Here's the data in a slope graph. So this is essentially a line graph, but it only shows the beginning and end of the time series. So this shows the survival rates in 1977 on the left and then 2015 on the right. Here's the data in a dot plot, which again shows the survival rates just at 2 points here in 1977 and then in 2015. And finally, here is the same data in a horizontal dumbbell plot showing the survival rates in 1977 and in 2015 with the change in survival rates highlighted there. All right, so now that we've had a chance to look at the data in different formats, a question that I will pose to you now is, what are some potential key messages from these data? And please feel free to pause the video here to take some time and reflect on what some key messages could be. All right, so as you might have guessed, there's usually not just one key message in a data set. So there are potentially many of them. So from these data, some ones that I thought of were in the US, cancer survival rates have overall increased since 1977. The data also show that prostate and skin cancers have the highest survival rates overall, whereas pancreatic cancer has the lowest survival rate. The data also show that since 1977, leukemia and prostate cancer have seen the most dramatic increases in survival rates, whereas survival rates of cervical and uterine cancer haven't improved since 1977. This slide shows some potential ways that the data set could support a wider message based on the key message that you want to convey directly from the data. So I'm not going to go through the entire table, but I want to highlight a few examples. So for example, if the message that you want to convey from the data is that cancer survival rates have increased since 1977, this data could be used to support a broader story that Americans are changing their behaviors to prevent cancer, or Americans are using screening programs more since 1977, meaning that cancers are caught earlier and more people are then surviving the cancer. Finally, this same data could also support a broader message that there are more effective cancer treatments now compared to 1977. Another example here is that if the main message that you want to communicate with this data is that pancreatic cancer has the lowest survival rate out of all the cancers in the data, then this key message could support a broader communication that more research and funding are needed for pancreatic cancer treatments. Finally, a potential key message from the data here are that the survival rates of cervical and uterine cancer haven't improved since 1977. So this message from the data could support a wider message saying that the research into cervical and uterine cancer hasn't led to increase in survival rates, and that more research and funding are needed for cervical and uterine cancer treatments. So I hope this slide outlines the way that there are, firstly, various messages that one can glean from the same data set, but also that the way that these messages are framed and integrated with other pieces of information can support telling different stories with the data. So now let's pick a visualization that communicates the message we want to convey. So in this example, let's say that we want to communicate that the survival rates of cervical and uterine cancer haven't increased since 1977. And we want to do this as part of a research funding campaign to draw attention to this issue and raise more money for cervical and uterine cancer treatments. Question: which type of visualization would best convey this message and why? Here I've chosen a slope graph to communicate this specific message. And the reason I've done that is generally humans can judge slope very well. So this kind of graph is well suited to highlight that one category decreased or didn't change while others increased, or vice versa, if that is the situation. So you can see on the slope graph to the right here that even though the color scheme is not ideal at this point, it's quite easy to tell that all of the lines except for one have an upward slope. The next step is to create the visualization using effective design principles and remove any chart junk. So you can see that I've modified the graph from the previous slide to remove the legend and instead label the different categories on the left hand right next to the lines. And I've also added lines to the vertical axes. The next step, which I've done here, is to highlight my key messages. In this case, there's only one key message here, which is that US cancer survival rates from 1977 to 2015 have increased for all cancers except for cervical and uterine cancer. So you can see I've highlighted this using a bright orange in comparison to all the other cancers, which are blue. The next step is stylizing while ensuring accessibility. So you can see I've changed the font here. I've also added a blue background, and I've changed the symbol for cervix and uterine cancers in orange. So the symbol is now a diamond instead of a circle. So trying to integrate the element of shape as well as color to highlight my main message here. The next step is for me to contextualize this information if it's appropriate. So in this instance, what we're visualizing is the cancer survival rate, which means the number of people with cancer that are alive 5 years after their diagnosis, divided by the total number of people with cancer 5 years after their diagnosis. So the data sources for this data is the US hospital and cancer registries. So something to consider here is that we know that all cancers are diagnosed in hospital, so the numerators here are likely to be highly accurate. And I looked at the study and saw that there are high levels of follow-up and accurate death reporting, meaning that the denominators in this case are also highly accurate. So this means that in my situation, I don't see any major caveats with the data that are worth highlighting. And also, most audiences should be able to understand the meaning of survival rate. This is something that's been widely used in many different public health messaging over the years, and I have a good idea that most people will know what this means. So because of that, I'm not going to add any further contextual information to my visualization. So the final step I'd recommend is to pilot test this graph with the intended audience. So again, consider asking members of the audience, what is your main takeaway from this graph, and is anything unclear? So in this example, I didn't have a chance to do that, but if this were not just an example and I was doing this for my work, I would definitely ensure that I had time to do this step, and I also had time to integrate any feedback that I heard into the final visualization. That concludes the example and interactive activity. So my hope is that this activity has demonstrated the importance of visualizing data as part of the data analysis process. I hope it's also showed how one data set often contains multiple messages. And finally, it should have demonstrated that changing the visualization type can then impact the message of the data and what people take away when viewing the visualization. So some reflection questions that I hope you can consider were, what were your takeaways from this activity? What, if anything, would you do differently next time? And finally, how can this process be applied to your current work? This concludes the content of today's workshop on data visualization. As a reminder, this workshop has covered the various benefits of visualizing data to communicate information. It's also covered how to select appropriate data visualizations based on your communication goals. And finally, this workshop has outlined various steps to improve the clarity and effectiveness of data visualizations. This concludes the workshop. I would like to thank everyone for your time, attention, and engagement today, and leave you with the following quote from Making Data Talk. As a communicator, think more about what you want your audience to understand and less about what you want to say. I would also like to credit SlidesGo, which created this presentation template, which includes icons by FlatIcon, infographics and images by FreePic, and illustrations by Stories. Finally, I would like to acknowledge that this workshop is part of a series on social media communications, created with support from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Canadian Network for Modeling Infectious Diseases, and the Pacific Institute on Pathogens, Pandemics, and Society. To access other workshops in this series, please visit youtube.com/@PIPPSBC. If you have comments or questions, please reach us at smbc@sfu.ca or follow us on Twitter at PIPPSBC. For more information, resources, and inspiration related to data visualization, please check out the following websites and links described and linked in this table here. Thank you.